Hi, I'm Mike Parker from Mining Footprint. With me, I've got Jake Erickson, our international relations practitioner. Hi, Jake. How are you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Mike?
Very well, thanks. Last week, we talked about realism and some of the contexts that it might apply to in the mining world. And this week, we're going to move on and talk about liberalism. Now, Jake, in international relations theories, what does liberalism mean?
The word liberalism itself is interesting, right? Because we have all sorts of political connotations about what it might mean in the modern era, but international relations theory takes a step back to look at liberalism really from its roots, right? And at its root, liberalism actually comes from the Enlightenment era, and it has a very sort of humanist component to it, given the times in which there's an argument that universal human rights are a key component to how states and different actors at the international level interact with one another. So liberalism as a theory and as a framework for understanding the world is rooted in the perspective that universal human rights and respect for the common man is best achieved through cooperation between different actors, namely cooperation between the states to create institutions that mitigate behaviors between states and competition.
Thanks, Jake. Now, what's the relationship in your view between democracy, governance, and liberalism?
Liberal democracies tend not to conflict or go to war with one another. That's a really key trend that liberalism attempts to explain, and it brought about the creation of democratic peace theory, which argues that democratic states are less violent than authoritarian states. And the reason why that peace exists is because liberal democracies tend to, it's argued, engage in international cooperation in the form of institutions, treaties, alliances with one another, and in so doing create infrastructures and networks that really mitigate and arbitrate conflicts so that breakouts of violence don't occur or are less likely to occur. And where it really becomes interesting is in the mining industry, Mike. So I wasn't sure if you had any thoughts or ideas of institutions that come to mind in mining, but I'm sure liberalism would have a great application and explanatory power for it.
There are a plethora of institutions that exist with mining focus areas or in the mining industry itself that advocate the highest standards of governance, ethics, and social and environmental excellence for the industry on an international level. Examples are the UN supporting good social and environmental practices in mining, the World Bank through its IFC performance standards, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development with its mining regions focus, the International Council on Metals and Mining with its mining principles, are just a few examples. Some countries are advocating best practices to other countries, like Canada's Towards Sustainable Mining, which is a framework which has been recently adopted by the Chamber of Mining Industries in Argentina. And of course, some specific commodity industries have best practices for mines involved in a certain commodity, such as the World Gold Council for gold miners, among several other similar entities.
Would you say that those institutions encourage or reduce the level of conflict, either in a physical sense or a business sense? Would you say that they successfully arbitrate at the international level? How do you see that fitting into the broader picture of conflict reduction and ultimately encouraging peaceful and successful, monetarily successful business environments in the industry?
Yeah, these institutions may have slightly different roles or are used to obtain slightly different outcomes. For instance, if a company conforms to the IFC performance standards, this has been used as a benchmark for international lenders to actually finance the project. The OECD wants mining projects to enhance productivity and well-being of the regions and communities in the zone where they operate, and to leave a legacy of development. The ICMM, which is basically a business organization, has principles of best practices that its members should adhere to which firmly frames sustainability as an integral part of modern mining. These three examples are sort of truly international institutions or organizations with a big influence on modern mining. And there are several more institutions or frameworks with similar desired outcomes, which all are leading towards sustainability, stability, and development. Some of these institutions definitely have an influence on shaping state preferences and policies in the mining world. In fact, the World Bank has been instrumental in assisting in the formulation of some mining codes or laws for countries in the global south. The UN wants to ensure that extractive industries improve people's lives, and the rollout of Canada's towards sustainable mining as an industry preferred framework in Argentina is actually shaping the industry response there to sustainability.
Taking a step back and looking at all that, I think there's a couple themes that seem to ring true throughout this. I mean, number one, you wouldn't have this level of infrastructure, this level of connectivity, unless there was a real purpose behind it, unless there was a prior need for it. And you can actually see from a liberalist perspective, right, the view that when you have more of this cooperation, when you have more of these bonds between actors, that you do have some element of conflict reduction, or at the very least you have an organized way in which to go through an arbitration process over a given issue, as opposed to just fighting on a battlefield or in the office. Another thing that I think really comes out of this, and you talked a little bit about in terms of the development element, right? And liberalism would argue that when you increase the amount of infrastructure, you increase the amount of connections between states and treaties. Over time, states naturally tend to evolve in this democratic fashion, right? You diversify your economy, you increase the number of revenues going into the state, you build the institutions. All of that is really important if you want to try to create a stable country that ultimately fairly arbitrates and respects the rights of its citizens. So it's a very hopeful theory in some ways, I think, in that it really focuses a lot on how states can improve through the increasing the ties between them. And I think we see a lot of those echoes and reflections in how the industry continues to operate, right? And the way that countries play such an integral role, not just in mining arbitration, but even being able to settle disputes over contested plots of mineral resources, right? Where two countries might share in the same mineral resource, but they both want to benefit from it. So how do you engage in that transaction without there being conflict? And the answer is you need institutions, you need treaties, you need infrastructure to be able to successfully mitigate that process.
Yes, Jake, that's right. And it's certain that all these institutions have an objective to promote peace and conflict-free mining at various levels. Firstly, from an international level, international trade like mining helps to connect countries' economies and, as you say, reduce the scope for international conflict by creating dependencies in those various economies. This is, as you say, the democratic or commercial peace theory. Using the benefits of natural resource mining to boost the economy of a country can also be viewed as a means to increasing development and bettering people's livelihoods, which may lead to a more stable democracy. And of course, the massive global headwinds of climate change concerns and these other environmental and social issues are also addressed to various degrees by the policies and frameworks of these institutions. On a regional level, I think, as you mentioned, the existence of mining projects that are close to or actually cross international borders can also promote peace. A great example is the Pascua-Lama project, which is on the border between Argentina and Chile, high up in the Andes. And the fact that that deposit couldn't be mined or was viewed as only being possible to mine by having infrastructure in both countries resulted in the formation of a cross-border mining treaty between Argentina and Chile, which then, of course, linked their states closer together through economic and commercial ties. Mm. And on a national level, and perhaps the most obvious for modern mining, is the obvious desire that best practices may and should reduce the potential for mining conflicts in regions where these remaining resources are to be found. There are so many issues and problems revolving around social and environmental aspects of mining in this modern world that these institutions, both as international organizations and as commercial institutions and entities, are very keen to bring forward best scientific practices to reduce the impacts of mining, to make sure that the mining process is as sustainable as can be, mm-hmm. and to leave a legacy of development in the areas where the project has operated.
It's almost seems like the more that we move into the future, the more that mineral exploration revolves around either contested regions or areas of high instability or weak governance, that institutions will naturally come in just by nature of the industry, I think, and the sheer amount of resources that we're working with here at a given mine site. You're going to need some arbitration, some sort of legislation to adequately account for the exploration of those minerals and the production of given goods. So as we move on in the future, I think we'll see even more of this institutionalism and interconnectivity that continues to mitigate and arbitrate at local, national, international levels. Taking a step back, we can actually see how liberalism and realism do seem to be a little bit opposed to one another, or on opposite ends of the spectrum. On one hand, you have liberalism, right, which has a very optimistic appraisal of the international environment. If we're able to work with one another, develop institutions, strengthen our bonds between our fellow man, our fellow states, fellow company, you are going to see a reduction in violence and an overall opening of society in the form of good democratic governance. On the flip side, you have something like realism, which has a much less optimistic appraisal of the situation, and it revolves around a view of states competing with one another, and ultimately argues that unless it's for defensive purposes, that institutions don't seem to encourage that same democratic behaviors that is so key to the liberal perspective.
As mentioned previously, the institutionalization of the mining industry's approach to maximizing its positive impact and reducing the potential for conflict seems to be conforming to the principles of the international relations theory of liberalism. And when one adds in and considers the intervention of the UN, the World Bank, and several other international organizations that guide, promote, and encourage sustainable extractive industries on an international level, this liberalism theory is reinforced by the resulting commercial peace outcomes and dependencies. So there is, in fact, quite a good, strong parallel to be found in the way that liberalism on an international level between states also contributes or is in favor of reducing conflicts in large industries such as mining on an international level.
You can also see a little bit of a prescriptive component to it, right? I mean, a liberal institutionalist in international affairs might argue that the best way to reduce conflicts at this given site could revolve around increasing the amount of legislation or enhancing the amount of cooperation with other actors. So you can actually see what sort of prescriptions and what sort of theories an institutionalist might use to argue how to fix a given situation. Now, given the fact that we'll be doing future video conferences on other international relations theories, it's also important to note that there's sort of a cadre of individuals out there who will throw this all out the window and say that it's a very inherently biased perspective to argue that democracy is the only way to successfully mitigate conflict, right? Or that somehow cooperation is what has reduced conflicts and not the passage of time. Even when we dive into post-colonial theory in the coming weeks, something like maybe there's less conflict between democracies, but could that just be a symptom of what we saw in the Cold War, which was where conflicts between democracies were sort of reduced in favor of fighting conflicts on what a realist would call the periphery, right? Peripheral states where they're not directly in these sort of core power locations, but rather on the kind of the periphery where states can compete with one another. So there's all sorts of critiques that you could bring into the discussion here and ultimately open up to our future conferences that will go further into the post-colonial theory and the different economic theories that are all too often used in our field.
The very presence of all these international organizations and commercial entities which have encouraged the institutionalization of mining and ways and means to regulate and encourage best practices, all this hasn't obviated the presence of mining conflicts. In fact, there are several dozen mining conflicts on the go in the world at any one stage. And these sorts of social and environmental conflicts are the problems that stop major projects rather than technical or scientific problems. So obviously, this institutionalization is not the answer to all of the problems. And as we go forward, looking at more and more theories around international relations theories that we'll be trying to look at through the mining lens. And it just shows you that the best way of looking at mining problems is to look at this very pluralistic method of trying to bring in as much of the context and as many actors as you can. But mining conflicts, by their very nature, tend to be extremely complex and extremely wide-ranging. I'm looking forward to the discussions on constructivism and post-colonialism, which I think shine a very, very strong light on how some of these applications of liberalism may not be done in quite the best way. And in fact, even though the theories and ideas are very, very good, the actual delivery might be done in a different fashion to allow them to be more effective.
The two theories that we've already gone over, realism and liberalism, two very traditional sort of views of the world, usually state-based theories. We're still able to apply this to the industry. And I think that really reflects on the explanatory power of international relations in the first place, that we can take to the most arbitrary theories and apply them so successfully.
Thanks very much for another excellent discussion. Next week, our topic of conversation will be materialism. Stay well and stay safe in the USA. Until next time, goodbye.
Looking forward to it, and the same goes for you.